So, there's a lot of questions which ask stuff about free trade or globalization and whether this is a good or bad thing. So, from the UK's perspective, or just a general developed country's perspective, I would the best way to describe this is that one benefit of free trade is that it should cause total world output to increase. Do you see that first sentence is really snappy and answering the question straight to the point? But obviously, this depends on what actual question you're doing. This is just a generic example. So I got some definitions and then an explanation diagram, chain of reasoning, and evaluation. Free trade is the act of trading without protectionist barriers. Comparative advantage theory states that if each country specializes in producing the good or service in which it has a comparative advantage, then total world output will always increase. The theory can be described by a model of two countries producing two goods. So I've got country A and country B producing cars and bikes. So the next part, feel free to skip. But if you're good at maths or if you're confident doing this, then this is a really good way to show off. And I think most examiners would be quite impressed. So, but it's definitely not essential. I would kind of learn or think of sensible numbers. And I've basically just said that if each country produced halfway, so halfway cars, halfway bikes, then country A would produce 50 of each, and country B would produce 25 and 45. So the total world output would be 170 units. However, if country A specialized in cars and country B specialized in bikes, then we'd get 100 cars and 90 bikes, which is a total of 190. Therefore, total world output would be higher with each country specializing. I further explain what comparative advantage is and how to know what your comparative advantage is. So it's when a country can produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost than the other. And each country always has one. For example, country B is actually worse. It does not have an absolute advantage in either cars or bikes. However, it's just a little bit worse at bikes. So therefore, that's its comparative advantage. After this production, each country would trade the necessary amounts of cars and bikes with each other. So globalization and free trade should, in theory, increase total world output. And again, a snappy ending to explain what my benefit of free trade is. My evaluation, a detailed one. However, this model has some important assumptions which do not always translate well into the real world, and this can lead to issues. Firstly, the model only applies to when there is free trade and no extra costs of importing, such as tariffs. And this model also ignores various costs such as transportation, which could be high and therefore mean that it's not worth specializing. The model also assumes constant returns to scale, basically when there's no economies or diseconomies of scale. And this relates to the fact that economies can easily change, both through economies of scale, but also through economic shocks. If country A decides to specialize in cars, but country B has a natural disaster, then this whole diagram is going to change completely. And therefore, at this point, since country A has decided to specialize in cars, it's become over dependent or just dependent on country B's bikes. Now, this natural disaster or something else would cause an economic shock that affects both countries, and this would have significant macroeconomic objectives. For example, cost push inflation or a decrease in living standards if it means that we can't import those bikes anymore for that period of time. Or it could be cost push inflation if it's something else like oil or sand.